Hey there, I need y'all's help. I am taking a class called Christ in the Synoptic Gospels, and it's a Bible program that I'm doing right now where we have a different class each month. And at the end of the month, we have to do something where we sort of just show a little bit of the knowledge of the things that we're learning. So right now I am deciding to just make a little video and then share it with some people and then maybe call them and discuss it. So Christ in the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic Gospels, what does that mean? Gospel, of course, means good news. Synoptic means to see things the same as. So it's looking at the gospel. Of course, the Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's looking at the Gospels and looking at how the writers saw the good news in the same way. And interesting thing about the Synoptic Gospels, it does not include John. It's just Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John has a lot of just different things that are included in the others. So whenever we do a study of the Synoptic Gospels, it's just the first three. And I'm going to jump around a little bit over some of the material, just a few different things. An interesting thing, Matthew is the first one, and it is actually the bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it starts right out with the genealogy of Jesus. Matthew wrote it to the Jews, and one of the important things was to prove that he was the son of David. And Mark and Luke were written, Mark was written to Romans, while Luke was written to the Greeks, but both wrote to Gentiles, obviously, and not to the Jews. In chapter 3, it talked about historical background. And it's really interesting about the different empires, that the empires leading up to the birth of Christ, first one would take over a little bit of land, and then another one would come and take over more land, and then more land. So the Greeks came in and they took over a large portion of the Middle East, and they introduced their language, the Greek language. And then the Romans were the last ones that came in. They were much more powerful. They took over everything and, of course, added more land as well. Now the Romans, everybody knows the Romans road. They put in roads throughout, which made travel. And at this point, when Jesus came, communication was good because everybody was doing the Greek thing. And travel was a lot easier because of the roads that the Romans were putting in. And the Romans also brought a lot of peace politically, which made it easier for the gospel to spread throughout the whole area after Jesus was gone. Chapter 4 was really interesting. Jewish religious system, and it talked about things like the Pharisees versus the Sadducees and what the differences are between them. Now, Pharisees, we hear more about them in the New Testament than we do the Sadducees. The Pharisees were a governing body. They were a group of religious people who were all about the law. They had learned their lesson when they were in Babylon and they were exiled, that they can no longer do it because for centuries in the Old Testament, the Jewish people had gone to God, and then they fell away and started doing the idols of people around them. And then God would bring judgment upon them. And then they would cry and come back to God. And then they would do it again. They would go back to the neighboring countries again and do idolatry again. And then God would punish them again. They finally learned their lesson. And so instead of doing idols of people around them and worshiping gods of the people around them, they instead decided to get very, very strict with their own Jewish law. So they went crazy on that, and they, did everything possible to stick with the law. Interestingly, they were in the synagogues. The synagogues were all over Jerusalem, all over Palestine, that whole area of Israel. The synagogues were all over the place. They were the local governing body where people could just go to talk about the scriptures. So the Pharisees were all over Israel. Now, on the other hand, you have the Sadducees. The Sadducees were actually the priestly body. And as we know, the temple is in Jerusalem only. So because of that, that's mainly the Sadducees were mostly just in Jerusalem. And interesting, the Pharisees were working class, middle class people, whereas the Sadducees were they were the elite. They were extremely wealthy. Now, these were the men that are going in and making the actual sacrifices in the temple. And what's really interesting is they weren't actually concerned with keeping Jewish law. They actually embraced the Roman rule and thought it was good for the people. What they valued the most is stability. They wanted to keep their way. They liked their sort of cushy way of just being in charge and having lots of money. They didn't want anything to change. And it's really a sad thing. Oh, let me just go over a few other things about these aristocrats that ruled. They followed the books of the law, but they rejected all the books of the prophets. And they didn't believe in angels, and they didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe that people would rise up and have a life after death. And so it's fascinating to me that even though they are the priestly body, that they were not actually very concerned about things of God as much as they were concerned about politics and their way in life. So that's the only things I'm going to cover here for now. But please drop a comment down below and like this video for me. And thanks for listening.